A crucial change in the world came about after devastation left after the Second World War. Immortalized imperial nations began to bend under the widespread terror of communism, the very embodiment of the enmity to their ideologies. As their newfound enemy gained power and momentum, these nations foresaw the threat communism posed to their absolute rule, and instead turned from the subjugation of their colonies to instead their liberation and amity. In showing the collapse of colonialism and the beginning of revolutionizing world with shifting alliances and global institutions to foresee the harmonious relationships between nations and to strengthen the global economy. The struggle for peace and prosperity that characterized the 20th century is often credited with the creation of the modern world. With the newfound changes of the 20th century, many conflicts were resolved, but these revolutions also played a hand in the creation of new conflicts, many of which have consequences that stretch into today's modern world. It was inconceivable that the vast proud empires of the 18th and the 19th century would ever concede defeat at the hands of an enemy. Indeed, just between Great Britain and France alone, almost half of the world's area could be accounted for in the 20th century. But as history has taught us, no one empire can outlast time. The flames of the World War II were evident throughout Europe and its effect profound everywhere, especially in Britain and in France, where destitution stalked the streets and colonies lay shattered and conquered. Their lands were now occupied by American and Russian forces fighting for supremacy, as they instead turned their efforts to halt the glowing threat of communism, which threatened the remnants of the once great empires. France, weakened by much of the war, was loath to surrender its last remaining colonies, such as Vietnam. Colonies were left impoverished as their sovereigns extracted their wealth and resources for their own use. This resulted in the possibility of the colonies revolting and defecting to the communists. Determination and desperation drove the great superpowers of the 20th century, such as France, Britain, and the USA, to give their colonies independence and to introduce a government very similar to that of a democracy. The French, humiliated by the Germans, were reluctant to let go of Vietnam and instead tried to keep a grip on the southern portion of the country, which resulted in a confrontation between the Vietnamese rebels and the French troops. It was when a French warship fired on the port of Haiphong that communism officially declared a war of liberation on the democratic superpowers, resulting in the Korean and the Vietnamese wars. Algeria gained independence through revolt, while the African colonies of France won their independence through negotiations. Several American and European colonies followed up with their liberation, such as India, the Philippines, Indonesia, Zaire, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. The occupation of their colonies by the imperialist nations left no regard for the conflicts and the pre-made arrangements between groups competing for social and financial dominance, and as a result of their liberation, havoc and political turmoil reigned between the groups brought into direct conflict with each other. Civil wars, massacres, and genocides began to arouse international concern and attested to the idea of a global organization or a peacekeeping force to ensure history did not repeat itself. Angola and Nigeria were two of the many continents ravaged by civil strife, by opposing political rival groups, bloody battlegrounds, a symbol of the adversities they faced. India, torn between the differences of the Muslims and the Hindus, erupted in yet another civil war, which forced Britain out of India. Indochina also resisted the call of peace, as communist groups competed for total control. Cambodia's radical communist leader, Pol Pot, began to massacre his own people, much like the genocide in Rwanda. Something had to be done to diffuse the mass unrest spreading across the world. The United Nations, one of the most influential and essential global organizations of the 20th century, is a collection of over 180 nations today, which each have a say in the missions the UN undertakes to make the world a place people would actually be happy to live in. It functions as a democratic system, and if the quota is met, troops and aid are dispatched to regions in the world plagued by famine, poverty, internal strife, and war. The UN mediates conflicts before they can escalate to a critical level, such as the case was with the Suez Canal crisis during the Cold War, and in some cases, if need be, send troops to enforce law and justice. The UN played a crucial role in the Korean War, when North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, as well as their swift intervention in Rwanda, the Congo, and the Cyprus. The UN provides more than just troops to conflicting regions around the world. The World Health Organization, the WHO for short, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, the UNRRA, the United Nations Children's Fund, the UNICEF, Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the World Population Fund have done more than their part in ensuring the world is a much more pleasant place to live in. Other governmental organizations such as the Red Cross and Amnesty International are also accredited with improving people's lives worldwide. There is no doubt to what the UN has accomplished and as to how essential it is in modern society. However, just like any democratic system, the UN also has setbacks. Any of the 5 permanent members of the organization, including the USA, the UK, China, Russia, and France, could immediately veto any decision made by the Assembly if they don't support it. This prevents the UN from acting against violence or terror in the world if one of the 5 members supports it. Often, aid may also be delayed as countries decide what's in their best interests, especially when timing is crucial in cases where hundreds and thousands of lives can be saved with the swift intervention of the UN. Peace has always been an unattainable fiction we have strived for, yet conflicts and hostilities around the world keep us from achieving true paradise. How close we can come to it, however, depends on to what lengths we are willing to go to sacrifice our differences for unity. With this mindset, post-war Europe began to fabricate a plan to unite all of Europe together and to make the nations dependent on each other, forcing them to set aside their differences. The first step towards this realization was the European Coal and Steel Community, which closely knit together the economies of the European countries. The ECSC was broadened by the Treaty of Rome to form the European Economic Community. Shortly after, the creation of a European Parliament allowed the manifestation of the dream of political unity. In 1992, the effectiveness of the European Union was increased with an increase in the power of the European Parliament, the creation of a common currency, the euro, a common banking system, and a common passport. The European Union also strove to protect workers' rights, regulate television programming, and control pollution of automobiles. The European Union was officially established as of July 1, 1994. Today, the European Union is a large territory with many resources and a highly educated population, controlling a third of the world's trade and is home to some of the largest banks and insurance companies. Its success is also unmistakable by the fact that 7 of the world's top 10 trading nations are European.
Following the Second World War, China was in a devastated shape. The Japanese had occupied mainland China for over 5 years, and by the end of the war in 1945, China was only a shell of what it once was. The Nationalist Party of China was faced with the task of rebuilding the country. With aid of the United States, nationalist forces were provided with the materials and the funds to rebuild the broken nation. However, the National Party proved inefficient with the funds provided, and the people turned to China's right-wing counterpart, the Communist Party. These two political parties and their supporters clashed, sending China into a civil war. The two sides fought until 1949, when the Communists came out victorious, with Mao Zedong as the first president of the People's Republic of China. Mao began his rule with a focus on revolutionizing China to form the communist ideals. This period of time came to be known as the Great Leap Forward. Mao's first motion was destroying the class of rich landlords. By redistributing half of China's land to royal households, landlords no longer held the power in China. Mao's next order of business was reorganizing village life. Mao had thousands of farmers relocated to cities to manufacture steel in an attempt to industrialize China. However, the Great Leap Forward was plagued with a number of issues that Mao failed to recognize. When a nationwide famine caused in part by the newly introduced farming techniques and the lack of farmers, Mao was forced to resign from his place as president. After a brief hiatus, Mao regained support and reclaimed his position as president, claiming he had a new plan to help reach the goals of the communist revolution. Mao believed that there was still a large power gap within China. He aimed to destroy the re-emerging bourgeoisie class and restore the ideals of communism by reorganizing education and traditional culture. Mao targeted the largest mass of people to carry out his wishes, mainly the peasantry and the youth. For 10 years, education in China was halted, as only Mao's Little Red Book, which contained his ideals and beliefs on this cultural movement, was studied. This cultural revolution would throw China into a state of turmoil until 1976, when Mao Zedong died. Since Mao's death, China has been able to re-immerse itself in international relations, has joined the United Nations, and has also westernized their policies, all the while retaining true to their communist beliefs. This new age China has become one of the most powerful countries in the world.